my name's Kaitlyn O'Gara, and I will be doing the Nationals Public Forum topic analysis for Champion Briefs. For Nationals this year in Birmingham, Alabama, the Public Forum debate topic is Resolved. In East Africa, the United States federal government should prioritize its counterterrorism efforts over its humanitarian assistance. So in this case, what we're looking at is another Africa topic, which is very similar to the Sahel one that was run just a few years ago. So when we look at this topic, it's important to notice a few things. First of all, for those of you debating this topic, you're most likely going to be at the Nationals tournament, which means that your arguments aren't going to be able to be stock, you're not going to be able to have general front lines, and you're not going to be able to handle this resolution like you would have almost every other resolution this year. So let's specifically first look at a few key terms, because in this topic, you literally can't misunderstand any single aspect of the resolution. You need to know exactly what each part is talking about in order to make sure that you have an advantage in the round and have some general regional understanding over your opponents. So the first key thing is to understand what the Eastern Africa region is exactly. So it would be defined by the United Nations Statistics Division Scheme that there are 20 different territories that constitute Eastern Africa, which can be found with a simple Google search, but do include those like Tanzania, Ethiopia, Somalia, Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan, as well as Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Madagascar, and Egypt, Sudan, and South Sudan. And all of these different nations combined make up pretty much what seems to be the eastern border of the African continent. So when we look at this region, it's extremely important to notice a few different things. The first is that the United States already has some kind of an influence over the region, already has some kind of a presence over the region. This exists in both the counterterrorism effort and the humanitarian assistance. Now, this video isn't going to cover the background knowledge because as national qualified debaters, you should have already done the background knowledge necessary to figure out exactly what the United States is currently doing in the region. My job in this video is to help explain to you exactly why counterterrorism should or should not be prioritized and why the region can be so clearly defined by the actions that the United States takes. So what we're going to do is we're going to analyze different scenarios in which counterterrorism would or would not be more effective. But it's also extremely to remember throughout this topic that you're not looking at solely doing counterterrorism efforts or solely using humanitarian assistance. This topic is explicitly asking you to just do one a little bit more or a lot more than the other. You're still going to see both in the region. So never let either side say that it's going to be a one-all solution, that you're only going to do one thing, because that's never going to be true in the context of the word prioritize, which I highly recommend having a definition for on backhand, just in case you get into any of those definition issues in a debate. So let's first look at what the African region seems to want. Now, there seems to be, in general, a high demand for counterterrorism. This doesn't necessarily mean directly that there's not a demand for humanitarian aid, because obviously that can be a very important and critical facet of policy in the region. But we do seem to notice that the prominence of counterterrorism does exist in the status quo, which is extremely important. The United States actually not only has had counterterrorism policies in the past, but is shifting its policy further toward counterterrorism. So what the administration, not only through Obama, but also through President Trump, has been doing is to boost U.S. military spending and basically just accentuate our presence that already exists in the region. While at the same time, in the status quo, we do seem to be having some major shifts and cutbacks in foreign aid. Now, this is something that is definitively unique because of the Trump presidency. Remember that these kinds of cuts are going to inhibit or help what kind of policies that the United States wants to put forward. And that's definitely something that the affirmative, more so than the negative, can use to their advantage by accentuating how important those cuts can be to foreign aid and how devastating they can be and prevent aid from being effective. But the region of East Africa itself seems to be okay with this shift in the status quo, with looking more at this counterterrorism. We see that the leader of Chad said earlier that in the Sahel region, for example, there was going to be a space for terrorists unless there was immediate coordinated action. So we see there's been multiple occasions that can be found of these leaders coming out and saying that we need to coordinate efforts. And that's a really important phrase, because the African government recognizes that they're not going to be able to take this situation and handle it by themselves. They know that they're going to need the United States or other nations to help them, and as of yet, we don't see other nations stepping up to that challenge. So what's extremely important to note is that basically we see this high demand in the African governments to have the United States step forward and basically do something about counterterrorism, which is why we see this shift occurring. So the White House, as a result, has continued to threaten these Africa-based terrorist groups and commit ourselves to working with African partners. So that counterterrorism effort definitively does exist in the status quo. But although it can be said that the foreign aid has existed for longer, which is also something that you can look up on both the USAID website as well as the new White House pages that drafts explicitly what kind of aid they tend to keep. Now, the United States needs to stick with a consistent message, which is why this resolution is so important. So today, for the rest of this video, we're going to be looking at two different things. The first is going to be the benefits of counterterrorism and explicitly why counterterrorism uniquely helps the region of Africa, before explicitly looking toward the opposite and saying why foreign aid uniquely is going to be beneficial. Now, it's important that we weigh both of these, of course, because that's the whole intention of the resolution. By looking explicitly at each benefit, it's going to be easier in the end to look at the judge and be able to list certain benefits that are guaranteed to come from a policy, rather than trying to just generate these weighing arguments at the end. And that'll be more clear throughout the video. So what we first need to look at is exactly why counterterrorism is going to be beneficial. And so counterterrorism is going to be able to guarantee that nations can be built. Now, East Africa is generally going to be an unstable region. There are a few spots on the globe that are as troubled as East Africa, because we see that there's issues like South Sudan, who's dealing with conflict. We see issues in Burundi, where we see political crisis, and political crisis and conflict are going to continue to be a problem throughout the region. But how are these problems exacerbated? And the answer is through terror. Terror is always going to be an issue when it comes to these governments trying to reach this peaceful edge. Now, these governments are trying to be stable, regardless of whether or not they're going to be as stable as we would like them to be. We notice that these weak states in the region that are trying to build themselves up become open to terror attacks. Weak states in general will facilitate terrorism, which has been found in multiple studies, including some of those that are listed within the Champion Brief's arguments. We see that these conditions pose massive dilemmas for local inhabitants, because weak states allow for regime change. So when terrorists come in, they use something known as provocation and intimidation to essentially either force the regime out or force the regime to align with what they want, because the state is so weak that they can't do anything to stop that. We see the instance in which Al-Qaeda used to threaten the United States and say, you no longer can be a democracy, we are going to murder democracy, but because the United States has a strong government, we were able to act against that with the war on terror. But these governments in East Africa don't have these same opportunities, so therefore they are open to intimidation, and they are open to be attacked by these terrorist regimes and influenced by these terrorist regimes. But specifically, this is a problem in East Africa, because the rise of al-Shabaab, for example, in the region was a massive one, where we saw that there was just 33 people one day, and then there's more than 5,000 troops fighting for them in 1 year. It's more radical than almost anything we've seen in the past, especially within the East African region. And it's one of the major threats, which definitely is going to be a problem, and is something that we need to deal with, because it's going to keep expanding, it's going to keep facilitating intimidation, it's going to prevent nation building. But this kind of insecurity has a destabilizing effect, because not only do we see terror attacks, which are going to be harmful, which are going to kill lives, which is definitely a permanence effect that I would have the affirmative point out, but we're going to look specifically that there's going to continue to be spiraling insecurity, where not only is one government going to have a problem, but we're going to see that government is going to allow all of its neighboring governments to fall under as well, because of the domino effect. And this kind of insecurity shows because as each of those governments within East Africa have become more and more fragile, we notice their neighbors doing the exact same. We notice that these terrorists continue to keep winning their fights, and when one nation in the area isn't stable, it definitely is going to affect those in the region as well, which is going to be a massive problem. But what we look at is further with nation building, and another reason why counterterrorism is going to be important is because economic growth is benefited more by counterterrorism efforts than anything else. Economic growth is stimulated when you have an economy and trade that is able to take place without interruption, and terror attacks definitely are going to be a major problem when it comes to that. We notice that countries that have large amounts of counterterrorism efforts are more likely to be stable, are more likely to have free-flowing economies, are more likely to be able to conduct trade with others than any other program happening in the region. So we've looked specifically at counterterrorism and how it allows for governments to be stable. And what I would urge the affirmative to do is stress to the judges and your opponents the exact impacts of a government being stable. Because a stable East Africa could completely change the entire region and completely change the whole ballgame. It's going to guarantee that less people are dying. It's going to guarantee that more people are getting the resources they need. It's going to improve the economy, which in general boosts the world economy. And all of these are beneficial things that come from halting violence specifically. But what happens when we don't look at violence? What happens specifically when we look toward foreign aid and why foreign aid could be beneficial? So we notice that United States foreign aid may not always be the most successful thing that has ever existed. There are chances in which third world governments have had corruption issues, have been unable to utilize aid as well as we want it to. But it's so important to recognize as the negative team that you do not need to be working with the same system that has always existed. Just because we have a status quo for how we give out foreign aid does not mean that's how we need to keep the status quo going. So we look at the instance in which, although there are shortcomings of the current aid process, which you definitely can concede to, donor governments can grant deep debt relief. They can plan a reduction in net flows. They can completely change the way that the system exists to guarantee that we don't see this kind of corruption, to guarantee that we don't see this kind of mishandling. And actually, these kinds of things were found on an international level because the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness at the High Level Forum that happened in 2005 proved that over 100 donors, bilateral and multilateral, are trying to develop new ways for developing aid. And this has continued to be developed since 2005 and is still an ongoing process. The United States needs to commit itself not to giving up on aid because we think aid doesn't work, but to giving up on our aid system because the system is broken. What we see from foreign aid is that it never really is ineffective when it's actually used. Like what happens, we either see the money disappear or the money go toward the wrong thing. But when money actually goes toward the thing that we need it to go to, we notice that it's actually extremely effective. We give Israel $3.1 billion of military aid every single year, and their military is extremely strong and we don't see any problems there. And that's because their aid system and the aid system that we use to give them their military aid is successful. Aid is not the problem, it is the system in which it is developed. And that is what I recommend the negative focus on more importantly. But the other thing that the negative needs to focus on is that East Africa is basically under this idea of aid dependency, where we notice that there is going to be a bit of a difficult time if we try and stress counterterrorism efforts over humanitarian aid. And when we look at humanitarian aid, once you start giving it, you can't exactly pull away from it because the government isn't quite at the point where it is able to handle its situation without aid. So what's really important to notice is that humanitarian aid, once given, is almost critical. Like you can't take that away under any circumstance because there's no guarantee that that situation is going to become any better. We recognize the fact that there has been successes when it comes to the aid we have given, and that's also an important thing that the negative should be pointing out. For example, the AIDS epidemic is one that the United States has invested in and should continue to invest in, because if the U.S. gives $11 to $12 billion to prevent new HIV infections and scale up treatment in Africa, it could almost completely wipe out the AIDS epidemic that exists. We currently need only $3 to $4 more billion in order for this kind of impact to happen. What we need to recognize is that aid is a long-term process, and we have started that process and we need to finish that process. Because if you pull away from aid, it's not necessarily that the continued giving of aid is in and of itself going to be extremely beneficial, although it does have benefits, but it's that the scaling back of aid provides more detriments than anything else in today's debate. At the point in which you're saying that counterterrorism and aid, you're going to have to choose one of them, this is the point in the debate in which you weigh. You have to see whether or not that stopping violence is going to be more important in the debate, and that's going to provide more general impacts that are of the greatest magnitude and have the longest permanence and time frame. Or you could look at the instance in which is taking away foreign aid going to be a bigger problem. Because if you take away foreign aid, you not only increase the AIDS epidemic, but you decrease the stability of governments, which then again opens them in turn to weak states facilitating terrorism through intimidation and provocation. This debate is all about making a very clear and distinctive decision. You're pulling back on one and pushing forward on another, although you're not completely getting rid of the second one. So if you're on the affirmative, what you're looking for is this why stopping violence is always going to be better. You're going to be looking specifically at why these states can be stable with counterterrorism efforts and how they can indeed be successful. And you should be stressing that more than the failure of aid, because you're not trying to take away aid. Aid is still going to exist. So if you say, oh, well, aid leads to lots of corruption, and aid is going to make these governments mishandle money, you're not getting rid of aid, you're just enhancing counterterrorism, which means you still have corruption in the affirmative world. So don't focus on aid programs, and vice versa on the negative. If you focus on foreign aid, you're not taking away counterterrorism. Don't talk about how counterterrorism efforts are going to lead to loss of civilian life, because you still have that in the negative world. In this instance, what you're looking at is why uniquely the program you're prioritizing is good, and that is what the judge will and should be looking for. Does stopping violence lead to more benefits, or does ramping aid up going to be more beneficial than scaling it back? Compare those two. Weigh those two in the debate. Don't get caught up on details. Now, as a side note, given that this is nationals, remember that it isn't just going to be about these arguments that you hear about, and it's not just going to be about the arguments you think you can walk into the round with. It's going to be adapting round to round. It's going to be using evidence indicts. It's going to be creating Google News alerts so that you know what's happening in the world every single day of that week-long tournament. You will win this tournament if you do those things. If you stay up to date with the world, if you stay up to date with the tournament, if you focus on your cases and making sure that you have the front lines needed, you have the answers needed. Have good evidence, have real evidence, be smart, think fast, and don't try and play dirty, and that is how you're going to have a leg up at nationals this year. This topic is going to be an interesting one. It's possible it could change as the budget seems to flow through Congress and as we notice that the budget becomes more and more finalized. But I hope that this video could be of some help to at least examining what you should be focusing on during these rounds. And with that, I wish you all the best of luck at nationals this year. And I know that y'all are going to do great.